Hello, everyone. On behalf of DevelopmentAid, I welcome you to today's webinar on looking beyond the crisis, possible scenarios for post-pandemic development. My name is Ion, and I'll be the moderator. Please put a plus if you can hear me well. This will be greatly appreciated. Before we start, I would like to touch upon some technical details related to our broadcast. Your cameras and microphones are automatically muted, so any questions or comments that may arise along the way can be submitted via the question section on your screen. Note that we plan several polls during this event, so please don't hesitate to participate as your opinion matters to us. The first poll will appear on the screen in a few moments. Today's discussion is one in a series of webinars organized by DevelopmentAid, in which we touch on various topics related to the international development sector. Some of the webinars previously held in these settings refer to how to do business with USAID, for example, how to write a technical proposals, or what is the role of AI in solving development challenges. We hope that you have enjoyed attending our previous webinars, but if you haven't had a chance, it will be my pleasure to share with you the links to the archive versions of those events. So please send me an email and I'll be happy to help you. At this point, we still have our attendees voting. So we will wait a few more moments and then we'll have the results shared on our screen. Okay, so you can now see the results on our screen. As you can observe, 68% of our attendees come from Europe. Another 12% come from North America. We have 8% from both Africa and Asia, and 4% from America. Thank you so much for participating. Without further delay, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Alanna Markle is Strategic Foresight Analyst with the OECD Central Strategic Foresight Unit. Her work uses foresight processes, features analysis, and data storytelling to illuminate complex issues from a systems perspective. Vicky Tongue, our second speaker, is the Head of Futures and Innovation at International Civil Society Center. Vicky has over 15 years of senior program management experience working with the leading NGOs and human rights organizations. Welcome, Alanna. Welcome, Vicky.
Thanks, Jan.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So before we commit, I would like to ask Alanna specifically. Alanna, how can you tell us how did you get into the foresight field? What was the motivation behind your decision?
Sure. Yeah. Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Yeah, so I got into foresight through my master's work. My previous career or work had been in community-based development, so a bit of a development background working in Nicaragua specifically with coffee-producing communities, and was introduced to futures via a kind of systems thinking research center where I did my graduate work, and it struck me as a really kind of powerful way of making sense of the complexity and uncertainty we've been seeing at the community level where I've been working. And yeah, so I kind of carried on with the work and learned some of the methodologies, and it's been really fantastic to apply it at the policy level.
So do you like it? Enjoy working in this field?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly interesting and dynamic. You meet really people who really think differently about how kind of institutional and social change can be done, and who are kind of, I think, pushing pushing institutions to think bigger and think beyond their normal horizons, and that makes it a really exciting place to be.
Okay. And how about you, Vicky? How did you get into the foresight field?
So unlike Alanna, I'm not actually a trained foresighter, so I don't have the kind of technical know-how, but I am lucky and I was really attracted. There's not many positions where you get to work with some of the leading international civil society organisations, working with their strategy community, helping them understand what some of the big trends mean for them and how they can make their organisations better prepared for those. So I think this role is probably unique in terms of convening a community on that. And as Alanna said, the future is a great place because it hasn't happened yet. So a lot of things are possible, and you can have different kind of discussions than being mired in what's going on in the present. And getting organisations to look outside of themselves and think bigger. It's a very exciting place to be. So I'm very lucky in the work that I do.
Thank you, Vicky. It's a very interesting thing that you said. Future is a very nice place. I like that. So while Vicky and Alanna was kindly answering my question, we had the second poll running. At this point, we have the results in, and as you can observe on your screen, about 66% of the attendees today represent consulting organizations. Another 16% represent NGOs. We have 10% representing academia, 6% represent supply organization, and then 3% represent construction field. It's very nice to see such a diverse crowd joining us for our webinars from different fields. Thank you again for joining us. At this point, I think we are ready to start the presentation. So Alanna, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen share going.
Just one second, I'll make the presenter again. It seems there was an issue with the, it should work now.
Okay, great. How's this look?
It looks great. It looks great, yes.
Thank
Please.
you. Well, thank you very much again for having me to DevelopmentAid, and to you, Ian, for organizing. It's really nice to be here. So today I'm going to speak first for a few minutes about the OECD Strategic Foresight Unit, and then a little bit more about what strategic foresight is. And then I might disappoint you a little bit because I'm not going to give a set of scenarios about what we think is likely to happen in the development sector going forward. So foresight's more about possibilities and exploring them together, not predictions. So I'm going to highlight some content from two pieces that we've produced since the start of the pandemic. And I hope that this will give some food for thought about the kind of changes that might be possible in the international system, which then may affect kind of future scenarios for global development. And from there, I really encourage folks to take the thinking further on your own terms and your own teams. So I'll spend just a couple of minutes on that, and then Vicky will develop that subject a bit further. So the OECD is an international organization. We have 39 member countries with a mission to promote better policies for better lives. We produce globally relevant analysis that touches most policy areas apart from really security and culture. So as the OECD's Central Strategic Foresight Unit, we are part of the Office of the Secretary General, and our mandate's really to strengthen the use of foresight in futures across the organization and its areas of analysis. So we support directorates and committees in their foresight work and coordinate work across the organization. We also build collaboration and foresight capacity with governments around the world and bring a long-term kind of futures perspective into global dialogue on key issues. For example, we're doing work now on the net zero transition. There's also foresight capacity in other parts of the OECD, and for this audience in particular, in the Development Cooperation Directorate. So you may want to take a look at some of their work. I've included it in a resources slide that will be circulated with this presentation. So what is strategic foresight? Foresight's an approach to thinking systematically about the future to inform decision-making in the present. So this includes the use of practices like horizon scanning, trends analysis, and using scenarios. So as practitioners, we recognize the fundamental uncertainty of the future and the impossibility of making accurate predictions over the medium and long term in particular. So it's really about exploring and preparing for a wide diversity of possibilities. And at its best, foresight is also a means of harnessing collective intelligence and doing sense making about what's happening in the world around us and how our world could evolve. Why practice foresight? In our view, foresight's really part of responsible decision making. So it helps design strategies that are effective across a range of possible futures, which makes our organizations and programs more resilient to future shocks and disruptions, and helps leaders identify and capture novel opportunities that may emerge. So the current coronavirus pandemic is an example of the kind of large-scale disruption that decision makers have faced and are likely to face again. So in our view, foresight is really not a luxury, it's a kind of form of due diligence that involves engaging proactively with the future, imagining and preparing for the unexpected, and designing adaptive, forward-looking strategies. So before getting into content, I'd like to say a few more words about scenarios because they're probably the best known means of practicing foresight. So a scenario is a story that illustrates basically features of a possible future context. So you can think of a scenario as almost like a simulation or a prototyped version of the future. And we build them based on weak signals and emerging trends we're seeing in the present. So scenarios are one among many foresight or futures methods. I've posted here an image of the foresight diamond. So, seeing that there are methods that kind of rely on higher or lower levels of kind of qualitative or quantitative data, or higher or lower levels of kind of participation, broad-based interaction versus kind of expert opinions. So scenarios really work, they kind of combine that creative and evidence-based side of foresight, and they work by stimulating reflection and dialogue about possible futures that are not often considered. So they enable a kind of exercise or rehearsal for how organizations can adapt to unexpected developments. And I think really importantly, they help us break free of assumptions and explore how we can be adaptive and effective in the face of unexpected change. So where we get the content for scenarios, as I mentioned, often comes from what we call weak signals. So scanning is the method we use to find weak signals. And it's basically about systematically looking for what's changing and what could be different. So weak signals are changes that we're observing in the present, which if they grew could lead to a large amount of disruption. So we're often looking at the margins at changes that are kind of low probability, but would have a very high level of significance or impact on our organizations if they came true. So just as an example, in 2019, remote work was kind of a weak signal that was being picked up. Some places were offering money or visas for remote workers. And of course, we all know now that's become kind of a major trend that could drive future scenarios about, for example, the future of work. So coming to the content, I'm going to start first with some of the work we produced around COVID-19 that came out relatively early in the pandemic. So in June of 2020, we produced a report, and I do want to add the caveat that we haven't really further developed that work, but I think there's a good bit of content in the paper that remains relevant and that's relevant for development. And I also wanted to note that the organization of the paper is around 5 different thematic areas. So one of the things about doing foresight is really looking outside of your own area of analysis or your own system. So we want to be scanning for signals of change across the horizon, because often those changes that are most significant or surprising come from another sector, like in the case with COVID, from the public health sector. So we use the phrase STEAG, society, technology, economy, environment, governance, just as a kind of easy way to help us remember and organize our scanning. So just kind of a tip if you're doing your own scanning in your organizations about domains to think about. So just a couple examples from this paper, and then welcome you to also check it out if you're interested. So we looked at critical uncertainties in this paper, and then for each of those we developed a number of kind of mini scenarios almost. So these are possible changes in the kind of 3 to 5 year time frame. Normally we look out more like 10 to 15 to even 20 years, but given that it was a crisis scenario, this has a kind of shorter time scale. So the first one I wanted to highlight is about shrinking civic space. So we have a question here about whether COVID and the fallout from the crisis would accelerate the shrinking of civic space or catalyze a revitalization of civil society organizations. And I think this kind of remains an open question. You know, there's a scenario in which COVID-19 and the resulting crisis further weakens the capacity and influence of civil society if governments continue to do decision making under kind of emergency rules and mentalities. So that kind of crisis mentality justifying limitations on dissent and financial pressures leading to a reduction in funding from governments and the public for civil society. And perhaps kind of limitations on civic mobilization and restrictions on in-person gatherings or increased surveillance or censorship in the digital sphere. On the other hand, another possible development or way in which this could evolve would be a real civic revival. So existing and new organizations and movements gaining support as a result of their contributions to defending the public interest during the COVID crisis. And civil society organizations really assuming more of a key role in convening democratic dialogue and articulating positive visions for change and holding governments accountable for delivering solutions to the challenges we face now and in the future, particularly associated with large-scale issues like climate change. And I would note for this one in particular, the Development Cooperation Directorate has a full set of scenarios on futures of the civic space. Again, that's linked. So if this is of interest, it's a resource available publicly. So another example from the paper, critical uncertainty in the area of economy, acceleration or reversal in corporate concentrations. So again here, COVID really accelerating and concentration in terms of all but the biggest businesses being pushed into bankruptcy and leading firms kind of sweeping in to acquire weakened competitors and consolidating their position through the rise in e-commerce and their kind of sheer logistical capabilities to be able to serve distant markets in a time of need. But on the other hand, perhaps there's still an avenue where we see a kind of digital decentralization with the crisis acting as also a wave of disruption to sweep away unproductive kind of zombie firms. And creating kind of new niches that allow for smaller, more agile firms with low cost structures or high levels of consumer loyalty, kind of underpinned and related to possible citizen-led movements to ensure a level playing field in digital platforms that really enable more kind of innovation in economies and interconnection among small firms. So this future perhaps is, I think some stats recently came out on the number of billionaires that were created under the COVID crisis, so maybe it's looking less likely, but I think one to still hold on to. So as I mentioned before, that kind of wraps up because we don't have much time today. The content I'm going to present from that paper, just a couple examples of the ways that we kind of structure and think about possible uncertainties in future developments. And as I mentioned before, it's really about collective intelligence. So having given some examples of possible kind of uncertainties and changes we've been looking at, we'd actually also love to hear some of your views on what could be coming next in the international system that could affect development. So using the Q&A function, I'd invite you to submit some possible changes you see on the horizon if you're keen, and we'll keep those anonymous and share some of those at the end. So we'd like to crowdsource some ideas. So please feel free to share any kind of what ifs or key uncertainties that you've kind of noticed but aren't necessarily on everyone's radar for the benefit of the community. So anytime for the remainder of the presentations. All right, so moving on. So following from weak signals, we tend to develop drivers of change. So For the remainder of the content, I'm going to present a little bit of analysis from a paper, a set of scenarios that we produced for the OECD itself. So these are scenarios looking at futures of international cooperation in particular to help inform the OECD's corporate strategy. But because they are kind of within the global system sphere, I think they also have relevance for development and developing organizations that are engaged in development. And I'll draw a few of those conclusions from workshops that we've run with philanthropies and with our development directorate at OECD to give you some sense of how these scenarios can be applied. So first of all, some of the drivers of change we were looking at. These are really focused on subjects relevant to the ways in which actors in the international system may interact over the coming decades. So we're looking at areas like geopolitics, digital transformation, and emerging global threats. So things like geopolitical tensions over the digital world, which could lead to a hardening of digital borders. So this is something we've seen signs of with India and then the US attempting to ban the Chinese social media company TikTok. On the other hand, we could see a push for greater unity and interoperability as digital economies become more interconnected. So it's this kind of question of the degree to which great power conflict is manifested in our digital infrastructure. And then we're also looking at things like shifts in value, so dematerialization, digitalization, blockchain, these kind of technologies changing how we think about scarcity. So shifts in values relating to both changing conceptions of well-being, as well as different ways that people connect and interact. And finally, we're considering some of the risks we're facing from large-scale global trends like climate change, biodiversity loss, and potential dangers from advances in technologies like biotechnology and artificial intelligence. So we use these drivers of change to develop a set of 3 scenarios. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly to make sure we have plenty of time at the end for questions. But these are really kind of designed to challenge some commonly held assumptions by actors who are working in kind of internationally focused organizations. And these are the kind of assumptions that potentially could also be held within organizations that folks on the call today might work in addition to institutions like the OECD. So our first scenario is called Multitrack World. So there's a common assumption that globalization will either continue or that the world will become bipolar. So in this case, we're thinking about, member countries of the OECD either ending up on one side or the other of a digital divide, but this is also relevant for thinking about structures of development cooperation, for example, between countries, or the kind of incentives countries or development organizations might have in their approaches to aid. What we explore here is an alternative scenario in which digital decoupling isn't so neat. So Multitrack World's characterized by the emergence of 5 separate parallel clusters of countries that operate really largely independently of one another. And what's key in this scenario is that former allies could be split between different clusters, and we could see a reduction in the systems that unite countries around the world in kind of unexpected ways. So relevance for development from this scenario that came out from some consultations are really actually opportunities for an increased role for development agencies, civil society organizations to be conveners and knowledge diffusers, including between countries that are no longer kind of working together on a regular basis. But this could also create a lot of pressure on the sector that could change the way that could kind of challenge traditional missions or approaches to doing development. And so what we do when we do scenarios is we'll typically look at opportunities and challenges they could create, and then we'll try to identify strategic actions in the present that are kind of no regrets actions that an organization can take to be ready for this, or for, ideally across multiple scenarios. So in this case, a strategic action that we've identified for development would be kind of strengthening the potential role of the development sector as a global bridge builder. The second scenario is virtual worlds. So this scenario is about the continued expansion of the internet and a world in which digital transformation really accelerates. So the assumption that we're challenging is that in-person connection will always be superior to virtual connection, and that global decision-making will be done primarily by states. So this scenario deals with the kind of concept of the metaverse. So one giant interconnected digital platform where people are spending more and more of their lives on virtual reality. And due to consumer demands, more and more powerful companies are making their platforms and cloud infrastructure fully interoperable. So this is, in a sense, a little bit of a counter to the last scenario. In this scenario, you also see kind of active civil society refusing to be segregated based on nationality or digital ecosystems, and governments really being forced to abandon plans for national firewalls that could create a splintering of the internet. So implications for development here, we have a kind of challenge to ensure surveillance-free access to digital tools, particularly in developing country contexts. But on the other hand, opportunities potentially to connect certain groups across the world that would really benefit from meaningful in-person connections. So an example that someone came up with in a workbook, in a workshop, would be kind of connecting young girls who might be kind of vulnerable in certain country contexts to role models, and kind of enabling them to be in a global space. And strategic actions in this scenario being fostering social connections around the world that really equip young people to be able to build inclusive digital futures, because they're really going to be the leaders, the digital natives, the Gen Z who grew up in this space, and who I think can help us manage it ethically going forward. And finally, the last scenario is vulnerable world. So a common assumption being that future global challenges will be similar to those we faced in the past, and the world can kind of muddle through on limited global cooperation. But we know that this may not always be the case. So in this scenario, humanity's actually reached a dangerous precipice of multiple coinciding existential risks, or risks that really threaten to extinguish humanity's long-term potential to prosper or even to survive. So in this scenario, we're looking at challenges that are really unprecedented, meaning that the strategies we've employed in the past, including around like nuclear conflict, may no longer serve, and we may need to reach much higher thresholds of sophistication and success and global cooperation to be able to navigate them. So examples of things like threats from unaligned artificial intelligence, runaway climate change, and bio threats, so essentially genetically engineered pathogens. These kinds of threats that a single actor could actually potentially be a threat to the entire human species. And this is really based on a lot of work that comes out of, if folks are interested in existential risk, out of the kind of Future of Life and Future of Humanity institutes. So in terms of thinking about implications for development in this kind of scenario, some of the things that we talked about in terms of challenges and opportunities could be a challenge being governments really kind of stepping in and failing to understand development type agencies as a key partner in this, and instead seeing them as an obstacle or a competitor. If there's a need to kind of create global consensus, governments really repressing the number of actors that are involved in that conversation. And on the other hand, again, a kind of opportunity for a global leadership role in forging a new vision of the common good, and particularly using the kind of skills within the development sector and civil society organizations around managing and running complex multi-stakeholder dialogues, which is something I think governments have a lot to learn. So finally, that ends the content stuff. Just a few more like tips if you are doing foresight in your organization. So horizon scanning is really the foundation of good foresight. And more complex scenarios should really have a basis in in scanning so that they have a basis in reality. So the standard we really aim for is provocative but plausible. And keeping in mind that disruptive changes often come from outside the system in which you work, so scanning really broadly. And if some ideas that you come up with or discussing don't seem a little crazy, then you're probably not being bold enough, because Foresight really should be pushing the boundaries of the plausible and of people's thinking. The lasting impact of Foresight interventions, finally, is really not only about the publication itself, but about the changed ideas of participants. So it's really a very process-based practice. And that's the reason that the most effective interventions often include members of leadership or senior management, but they really should also have broad engagement. So we encourage interventions to be inclusive of people from a diversity of backgrounds and positions within the organization. So you can find a lot more resources about Foresight online, and I've included, like I said, that resource slide. So that'll have some of the reports that I referenced, and then also reports and toolkits from others that have been published. So thanks again, and that concludes my my presentation.
Thank you so much, Alanna. Very interesting presentation. We already have some questions coming in, but we'll keep them for the Q&A session. And then Vicky, just 1 second, I'll have the presentation ready. So whenever you're ready, please.
Yes, Jon, could you just go back a couple of slides, please, just while you're doing that. So thanks, Jon, thanks, Alanna. Just a quick one-line introduction to the International Civil Society Centre. So we're a leadership convener, a platform for collaboration, and a knowledge manager for innovation and futures for the international civil society sector. I think Alanna's done a great job in showing how scenarios thinking can really lead to really interesting, exciting conversations and different types of conversation. And Alanna, you also laid the groundwork for some of the ideas that I'm going to kind of pick up on and develop around decision making, collective intelligence, regularity of scanning, and making it an inclusive process. So I'm not going to focus much on the content thinking from our work, but I would encourage you to look at the annex of the report, which I'm going to talk about now, and which is on the screen. And in there you'll find some insights from our sector convening, looking at some emerging areas for how COVID-19 might be interacting with some of these other global drivers. And I think you'll see a lot of similarity with some of what Alanna mentioned, particularly around the influence of non-state actors and some of the common threats to humanity like biodiversity loss and digital threats and surveillance. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in the content side, to look at the last kind of back end of the report. Could you move to the next slide, please, Jon? Yeah, so my contribution today will draw on some insights from our sector guide on strategic decision making in a whirly world. And this comes out of the sector's Scanning the Horizon community of international civil society sector strategists and futures thinkers. This guide draws on interviews from 14 global strategists from international civil society organisations and global movements, as well as more than 60 pieces of management literature on leadership, complexity, uncertainty and systems change thinking from the past 18 months. Could you load the next slide, please, Jon? So the guide includes 5 overall strategic pointers, and I'm going to draw mainly from 2 of them today, which I've framed there, around increasing diversity to build collective intelligence, to look around and look ahead, and to use scenarios cautiously across different timescales and with your whole organisation. There are these other 3 areas which are also really exciting, and I do encourage you to dive into the report and look at those. And we've also got a separate podcast which we can share after, which touches more on the other 3 pointers. The first point I would like to make is about when we draw on scenarios and what using them means in a post-pandemic world, and especially as we move more into a climate crisis future. We're all living in a world of never normals. There will always be continuous uncertainty and always imperfect information for strategic decision making. And with the democratization of shock, which has been so starkly exposed by the pandemic, we've seen this global wake-up call for what will come with multiple climate events. So we need to move from much more intermittent use of scenarios to the kind of regular and constant scanning for signals of emergent change, which Alanna touched on. What we saw during the pandemic with many international civil society organisations was a lot of upskilling and upscaling in scenario use for a range of reasons, for both operational and financial replanning, and also longer term strategic implications. But suddenly ramping up the use of scenarios during a crisis, especially if it's in an attempt to imagine post-crisis new normals, is perhaps just an exercise in creating a new temporary and false sense of security in what is actually this new world of never normals. So this point, I think, is scanning should happen continuously for anticipation and adaptation, and not just around crisis moments. And I think pre-pandemic, the other main use of scenarios which we typically saw was, a kind of context piece for new strategy setting, which happened every 5 years or so, those kind of strategic cycles. And these tended to be resource and time intensive processes focused around senior leadership, often with in-person meetings or workshops spread out over a couple of days, and often consultant led. And I think that what comes out of the pandemic and these wider equity, power and privilege conversations we've been having, at least in our sector, is this point around expanding who should be involved and how we can engage this greater diversity through digital means. Next slide, please, Jon. So we need to urgently diversify and democratise these conversations and include thinking from currently marginalised places and spaces which aren't usually consulted. Bringing in this wider set of perspectives will probably mean rethinking or even bypassing the traditional hierarchy and the kind of typical technical experts involved, and engaging people, new sets of people with the right mindsets rather than assumed knowledge. There's a great reference in the guide about how everyone was wrong in predicting the potential societal effects of COVID-19. Experts did about as well as lay people. And actually their single subject matter knowledge and expertise may actually box them into a particular way of thinking about the future. So you need more people who can integrate knowledge across multiple disciplines and are more uncomfortable with ambiguity, are willing to learn and open to taking risks. Another issue is the tendency to put ourselves at the centre of everything, and this is often highlighted as one of the big errors in international civil society organisation strategy making. We tend to put our organisations at the centre of making change and making social change in our own scenarios, when in the scenarios of others, we may not even feature as actors, or we may be actors that they want to marginalise. So this points to the need to really break out of our bubble and engage with other sectors, worldviews, unusual suspects, people who don't really think at all in the same way as we do, as a sector or as a group of organisations, to counter groupthink, to highlight biases and blind spots, and really build this broader base for collective intelligence about potential futures. My last point on this is that we should employ digital means to democratise futures conversations and signals intelligence globally. Weak signals and what is considered important will vary and could vary greatly in different parts of the world at the same time. And so organisations with a global remit need to strengthen this collecting and sense making of intelligence. And there's some really exciting methods that we've been learning about more and experimenting in our community for how you can do this digitally in a couple of hours, really open up, very low entry level for who can be involved and who can facilitate. And we've recommended these as resources in the guide, and we really recommend you go and take a look at those if that's something you're interested in opening out in your organisation. Next slide, please, Jon. So the final thing I want to cover is around imagination. To be able to accept surprise as the new normal, we should focus foresight and futures thinking more on the improbable and the unpredictable, and also more on discontinuities, so wider developments beyond single events. This includes imagined futures, sense making, and scanning for signals of emergent change at the peripheries of our experience. Traditional scenario techniques and how they've typically been used seem to fit more within this kind of anticipation for the future thinking, rather than the increasingly needed anticipation for emergence thinking, which is a useful classification from Real Miller in UNESCO. And I think those are good definitions, and there's more about those in the guide. And I think there was a range of experiences from international CSOs in using scenarios during the crisis. Some felt that the speed of change during the pandemic was too fast for a useful structured scenario process. Some found themselves to be better able to be prepared and have more resilient strategic decision making because of previous scenario work and thinking that they'd done. Some decided to run their own processes. Others took on and adapted reference scenarios from elsewhere. But there was this sense of kind of scenarios on steroids at lots of different levels of the organization. But I think as to go back on one of Alanna's earlier points, they are only for one method for thinking about the future, and they really should be used in this spirit of future savviness rather than future proofing. And by this, I mean, using them to open up possibilities, to look for new opportunities, new collaborations, new communities to better prepare for emergent change, rather than coming to these exercises with expectations about being able to reduce or eliminate uncertainty, or trying to predict a more probable outlook, which you can then use for your planning. So I think it's this plausible, but not trying to see what is more probable, because that will kind of box you into a particular way of thinking. So these exercises need to not just be anchored in information about the current situation based on management preoccupations and kind of the familiar worldviews or the comfort areas of those that have traditionally been involved. And this links to the diversity point that I made earlier as well. There's some fascinating research which we also reference in the guide, which highlights the kind of ordinariness of the scenarios, rather than the imagination in these kind of world after scenarios about the kind of post-pandemic world, which were produced at the height of the crisis. And they were mostly based on kind of continuity thinking and restoring the status quo rather than discontinuity, and really opening up new horizons for post-pandemic thinking. So I think there's a real kind of need for more creativity to cope with this complex and convergent world of constant change, which we've been describing. So just the final summary slide, please, Jon. Yeah, so my three key takeaways for post-pandemic futures thinking, based on this kind of collective work that we did, is more regular, less formal scanning. Make it as democratic, as inclusive as you can, so that we have these more diverse collective signals intelligence and sense making, especially in global organizations, and really picking up on the diversity that you have both internally and in your external networks, and being more imaginative around the emergent change that we might need to be prepared for, and to think about how we need to adjust our cultures and our strategies, so that we are better prepared for this world of never normals. So those are my insights, and I really look forward to seeing the questions that we get from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky. Just 1 second. Okay, so we have a number of questions. The first question, I think Alanna covered it briefly, but Aisha asks, who should be a part of the team working on strategic foresight in an organization?
Yeah, I can speak to this. I mean, usually, I guess organizations vary in terms of how much resourcing they're able to devote to having a kind of full-time staff capacity. I mean, we have 3 people, and then some governments have kind of 30. Depending on the foresight exercise, you know, you want to bring in people to be involved in a process from across the organization. So you want to have folks who have a kind of combination of subject area knowledge about the kind of question that you're interested in, and also people who have a kind of divergent or opposing perspective or a different kind of worldview from most of the people in the room, who are able to serve as a kind of productive challenge function. So there's a lot of emphasis, and Vicky can speak to this more as well, on and has mentioned kind of diversity and foresight exercises, and that means kind of diversity, I suppose, in representation, but it's also really diversity in worldview and background and style of thinking and the kinds of things people are paying attention to. So it's kind of also that ability to bring ideas that haven't been considered by the core team.
Mm-hmm. So the more diverse, the better.
Yes, definitely. And just like practically, if you're running a foresight exercise, you know, a core team that's really writing the scenarios, it kind of has to be a little bit on the smaller side, just because too many cooks in the kitchen. You know, probably no more than like 4 to 6. I know, just as like a benchmark, maybe like 4 to 6 people. But then your scenario workshops, you know, you want to have more like probably 20, 30 people, and maybe run multiple of those. Like for the OECD scenarios, we ran a kind of long series of those with staff at all different levels. We started with interns, and then we went up to like directors and ambassadors, and kind of hit all of those staff levels in between. So yeah, you want to make sure that everyone's voice is represented as much as you can.
Okay, thank you, Alanna. We have a question for Vicky from Richard. So Richard asks, under point number 2, there was the analogy to engage foxes rather than hedgehogs. Can Vicky please explain what she meant by this?
Yes, so this very much goes to the point around having a mixture of people with subject matter expertise, but not solely relying on them. And this is the idea that a kind of fox has hedgehog has one particular set of expertise. But actually, you also need to counterbalance that with people who are curious and can integrate thinking across multiple disciplines, and can bring in new ideas. So to really kind of open up the possibilities and make connections across disciplines. So it's not just people who have one more focused set of knowledge and tend to think that things will happen tend to think more that things are likely to develop in a particular way. And that also relates to some really interesting research run over kind of multiple years and at scale, and looking at when it comes to predicting the future, and when it comes to not predicting the future but thinking about the future, who is more often right. And the main thing that comes out of that is that people who have these kind of integrative mindsets rather than specialists, and actually specialists can be a bit overconfident in their own thinking, and that overconfidence can also lead to kind of like false thinking as well. So that's another really interesting bit of research in the report. So do dive in, and there's much more detail on it there, and all the references are, so you can dive into that. But yeah, that's what that relates to.
Perfect. Thank you, Vicky. Just an FYI, you can send me an email, and I'll be more than happy to share all the presentation with you, and also the links to the resources that Vicky and Alanna mentioned. We have another question from Bashar, which asks, how often should an organization have these horizon scanning meetings. So how often they should do that?
Vicky, do you want to take that one as well?
I mean, I wish we could do it more often, but there are some organisations where you see, you know, that they devote just a few minutes at the start of the day to seeing what kind of new signals there are, and there's interesting kind of software that you can use for collective signals scanning. One of the best examples that I've come across in the civil society sector is Amnesty International's work on China abroad, and they had 6-week scanning and signals exercises. They felt that that was what was manageable in their team, and I think that kind of regularity where you bring people together. So you could have a small group doing it a few minutes a day and doing it regularly, or you could do it over have longer periods, but making sure that sense making is happening and the intelligence is being shared more widely. But I think the more often you can do it to develop those muscles, rather than it being these kind of big intermittent heavy exercises, I think the more often you can do it, the better. And you know, I think once you start doing it, you get an appetite for it, and you build that. Alanna, your thoughts? Yeah. No, your thoughts, because I know you guys do this, and I think you've got that good practice, so you can probably share a really good sense on that as well.
Yeah, just to build a little bit on, yeah, I mean, totally agree. And just to build on that a little bit, one option also is to run scanning clubs. So we do this with our Foresight focal points from across the OECD. So those are basically folks that people that have been nominated or we've met over various engagements who have an interest in Foresight, and it's kind of like a monthly meetup where people bring signals, and I've included in the reference slides a kind of example Foresight exercise that we published in the COVID-19 guide. But you basically use your signal to create a what if question, and people submit these in advance, and then we kind of discuss them, everyone presents them, and then we pick one to cascade. So we use a kind of what you call a futures wheel. So it's basically like exploring if-then statements to look at the kind of knock-on consequences. So something like, you know, someone submitted an idea on, you know, what if air travel from COVID-19 remains really restricted between like two developing countries in particular. And so you take a kind of plausible extreme, and then you can explore the implications more broadly as part of your scanning as well, in addition to just collecting ideas. So that's, yeah, all I'd add.
Okay, thank you, Alanna and Vicky. Yeah, we received a very interesting input from Erica about the contribution to the question that you had, what might happen in the next 10-15 years. Can we show it on the screen?
Sure.
Okay.
You might have to give me presenter permission again.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'll. Here you go.
Thanks. Yeah, I had just mentioned. Yeah, so the contribution was what if there's a reduction in air travel from COVID-19, greater comfort with virtual interactions, climate crisis response prompting greater possibilities for true partnership with typically developing receiving countries based on researchers and consultancies, so shifting market practices. So this, for me, this question kind of, you know, started to get at this process, which is what I just mentioned. So you kind of have that what if of, you know, what if air travel is greatly reduced and folks really move into virtual working? So you identify signals that could happen, like, you know, Facebook producing this kind of VR meeting places as an example of a signal for that. And then explore those if then. So if that happens, you know, then there might be more partnership between typically development receiving countries, because they're able to have more of a seat at the table. And maybe a knock-on consequence of that is more pressure for senior leadership in development agencies being representatives of kind of development receiving countries. So you kind of look at those like knock-on effects and then bring it back to possible implications. So opportunities and challenges, and then actions you could take today, like starting to explore how to use virtual reality to do development, which is something not a lot of organizations, at least I'm aware of are doing yet. So just as an example of how this kind of discussion might unfold.
Can I just add, there's really good, particularly for civil society organisations that are looking for a kind of primer on techniques. There's a really good one developed. It's called The Future's Ours. It's in the report. It's been developed by Save the Children and the School for International Futures, and that highlights 12 techniques that Save the Children's used with partners and how it adapted some of those. And that's a really good starting point, I think, for methodologies as well. So I just wanted to flag that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Alanna. Thank you, Aria, for contribution. Another question that we have from Veronica. She asks, should we join other actors to develop scenarios, or should we keep it in our organization, internal?
I think you have to think about the resources involved and what you want to use them for. I mean, it was really interesting with our community to see where the desire to do it internally came from, and actually where people found the most useful thing was, you know, I mean, there was no end of external scenarios that were produced by others, and you know, you can also bring that in and just adapt some of it to your own purposes and some of your own contexts or priorities, and then have a really interesting discussion about what that might mean amongst you know, groups within your organization. If you want to do your own proper reference scenarios internally, it's not really a process that you can do lightly. I think there are other ways to start having just interesting futures conversations within your organization, which you can do in a couple of hours digitally. But you know, you generally find that if you want to develop your own scenario process, it's not a light undertaking. So that's just what you know, the kind of thing that we've heard from our organisations.
Okay, thank you, Vicky. One more question. Alan asks if you can suggest any digital tools that can be used for Foresight.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've heard of a few being developed, and I know that there are scanning database softwares. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Maybe Vicky can.
Yeah, so there's a couple of that I talk about in the report, and a couple that we've been working with. So one which is a really good entry level, kind of no preparation needed and very light facilitation, is Citrus Futures Frequency. So we experienced this in our community for the first time last week, and it was kind of 3 hours. There's a lot of really good facilitation resources that they provide, and it just takes you through a 3-step process where you work as a group in small groups. You kind of challenge your assumptions, then you imagine preferred futures, and then you move towards taking action by thinking towards those preferred futures through kind of headlines from the future. That, I think, is just a fantastic entry level way of having futures conversations, and it really puts people's heads in a completely different space. And you can pick a topic. We looked at the future of human biodiversity, so that is like just a great, if you just want something to pick up that you could probably implement, read about in an hour and just do with a group of colleagues next week. That's a great one. There's the kind of feminist futures post COVID-19 from the International Women's Development Institute. The International Women's Development Agency, an Australian-based CSO that works with feminist movements. That's great, I think, in terms of getting both futures thinking and kind of feminist thinking, bringing that in together. That was great. We had a great session on that. There's more kind of facilitation involved compared to futures frequency, but again, excellent support resources, Miro templates, everything. And again, you can kind of pick that up with a couple of hours prep. And then if you want to do kind of more interesting scenario development with a diverse group around the world on a particular topic, we have also looked at PAR-EVO, which is really interesting. You can both look at alternative future scenarios, but you can also look at alternative past histories. That's an iterative process, and it is more resource intensive, but it's quite exciting. You can there's lots of kind of intelligence about kind of people's moods that you can add to it. You can bring in external people to kind of comment on the scenarios. You can see which, it's kind of like you add to other people's scenarios, and you know who's in the broad group, but you don't know exactly who's written what. So you kind of see how these scenarios develop over time. You see what dies, and that's something I think that we want to look at doing more in our own kind of experimentation with diverse communities. But that's again digital, and there's I mean, that's developed by Rick Davis, but there's been a lot of interesting use around that as well. So, but that is a more intensive exercise that does require really good facilitation, but is digital and would work with kind of globally dispersed asynchronous contributions. So there's a couple there.
Thank you, Vicky. And the last question before we wrap up comes from Mutoni, and he asks the following question. So he says, linking the idea of regular conversation on scanning and that of democratizing the exercise, how do we avoid falling into a comfort zone?
Yeah, so I would
the same people.
I would think about who you're including, regularly bring in different parts of the organization, look outside the organization. I mean, I think one great thing about the digital space now is that, you know, there's been so much stuff that has been shared. Like there's so many webinars and kind of festivals on foresight and futures thinking, which is now much more accessible than pre-pandemic. There's all sorts of stuff, so you know you can see what's out there, and you can find speakers and bring them into your organization. And I think, you know, that's one thing that's been quite exciting about the kind of move to the digital sphere, that there's so much interesting stuff out there that you can kind of draw on. But I think the more people you bring in and who have an interest in this and the better, really.
Yeah, and I think you can also build a culture of commitment to really challenging yourselves to think outside your own zone. So I would almost think you could have, like, certain publications could be banned, you know, like no signals from BBC or New York Times, like they have to come from, you know, a tattoo magazine or, you know, some kind of wonky text publication or something, tech publication. So it's like really being mindful also about kind of challenging yourself to read stuff that might not intuitively be very easy, or to pay attention to stuff that's really like outside of your comfort zone or normal interest area, and kind of having that commitment as a norm in a group.
Okay, thank you, Alanna. Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, I would like to thank you both for finding time to join us today and for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us, and giving us tips on how to use Foresight and how to understand it better. We really appreciate that. I also want to remind our attendees to check our business development and recruitment tools that we specifically designed to assist individual experts and organizations in being successful in landing projects funded by international donors. Taking this opportunity, I would like to remind you about our next webinar, which is called Doing Business with GIZ, Procurement Guidelines and Recruitment Practices, that will take place on September 30th. As speakers, we will have Emmanuel Gebhardt, which is Director of GIZ Procurement and Contracting Division, and Saskia Weiss, Gerber, which is HR manager responsible for external recruitment at GIZ. They will provide some practical tips on how to prepare correctly for upcoming bids and how to be successful in landing individual assignments. I will share the link to the registration in this chat, so please don't hesitate to register. Just 1 second. Here you go. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to meet you to our next webinar. Thanks again, and bye bye.
Thanks, Jon.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.